charming personal essays from all the previous speakers. I have nothing of the sort. Mine is basically a geopolitical essay, and it's about China. So it's very divergent from what we've heard previously. And the questions that I want to explore and I want to answer are as follows. Will China be the superpower of tomorrow? Will it be the economic titan? Will it be the exemplary society? And we might as well start with the cold hard economics of the case. Now, according to a Gallup poll in America, 52% of Americans think China is the leading economic power in the world today, compared to just 31% of Americans for their own country. Now, if you look at the cold hard facts, the real figures, you find that the Chinese economy in GDP is about half the size of the United States. So there's a misperception of what the current situation is. China, as it stands in 2014, is not the leading economic power in the world today. But of course, as China's economy is growing faster than the US, if current growth rates for both countries were to continue, China would become the world's leading economic power by 2028. But this is also unlikely to happen, simply because China's economy has been growing at a rate of, on average, 10% every year for 30 years. And this kind of growth has been fueled not by the natural economic systems of China, but by huge government spending and huge outside investment. And Chinese total indebtedness is now 200% of GDP, whereas just 5 short years ago, it was merely 125%. This is what looks to be a bubble. And we have little reason to think that China will be so different from bubbles we have seen in the historical past. And in many ways, China today is reminiscent of the West in 2006 and 2007 and 2008. There is a housing bubble with 15% of all properties vacant. There is a booming economy built off the back of debt and loans. And there is the belief amongst people that the government has somehow broken the cycle of boom and bust. But if there's one thing we learned from the Great Recession that has happened, and is in still many ways being felt, it's that if it's probably too good to be true, it in fact is. But there's more to China than economics. China could, in fact, slow down its economic pace, as its leaders would want it to, and it could become the economic power in merely longer than 2028, but in a few short decades, in our lifetimes. And if this was the case, China would move to the next question. Does it want to be the geopolitical superpower, more than just a big economy or a manufacturing base? Does it want to project its control over much of the world, not in an imperial way, but in the way superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union have done for the 20th century? And this requires two things: military force and ideological allies. And China, for the price of being a superpower, lacks either. In terms of military force, whereas the US, the reigning geopolitical superpower, has 12 aircraft carriers, China has 1. And where many countries throughout the world have numerous overseas military bases from which they can conduct operations, China has virtually none. China, right now, is not in a military position to be able to wage multiple wars across the world. And whether that's even desirable is a very valid question. But nevertheless, the USA recently was able to do that in Afghanistan and Iraq, putting aside the merits of those events. And then we look at the allies of China and we find there are actually very few. There are many alliances of convenience, of simple economic benefit, but there's very little in the way of steadfast supporters. In fact, just as China's neighbors, just of that section, many of them are deeply opposed to China. We have Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, all opposed to China. China cannot even project hegemony over its own backyard in the East Asian Sea. let alone throughout the world. And, of course, besides the geopolitical question, we must also turn to what kind of society China is today. And we find it's a society where the GDP per capita is the same as Cuba and Iraq. And it's about 1/8 of the US, and similar figures for the rest of the West. And besides the economics, there's horrendous pollution in China. For example, in Beijing, average life expectancy has been reduced by 15 years on average because of terrible industrial air pollution. And that's unacceptable as a society, to live in that kind of state. And especially a state with no democracy, with very little in the way of property rights or the rule of law, and with a one-child policy that has led to millions of infant Chinese girls being lost to infanticide. That is unacceptable. And in many ways, while we are willing to aspire to China as a great engine of economic growth, much of China's mirage. Even its education scores, which are so renowned throughout the world, consist solely of one city, Shanghai, the most educated and most affluent province in all of China. It's mere misdirection to put us off a country that is still, in very large part, insufficiently developed and poor. But of course, China is, nonetheless, progressing in a way. And China's biggest resource will always be its people, its 1.3 billion citizens. And in a way, simply because its population is larger than any other nation, China's rightful place should be at near the top of the world order. And right now, China is underachieving.